If the New Orleans Saints are seriously ready to weather the PR storm that would come with hiring Jon Gruden, then his on-field contributions need to be on point. What would he bring to a New Orleans Saints offense? We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Big thank you for joining us here for another episode. I am your host, Ross Jackson, your credentialed media member covering the New Orleans Saints as the senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at a little bit of stay and go for the New Orleans Saints top 6 free agents. We're going to dive into whether or not Jimmy Graham is actually retiring, because his social media posts seem to kind of lean that way. And we're going to kick everything off with the contributions of what a Jon Gruden could bring to the New Orleans Saints offense, because if they're going to hire him, he's got to make a difference. Appreciate you as always being an everydayer and making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that Crossover Thursday is also happening for all the playoff teams here on the Locked On Podcast Network, which is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports. Visit prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the promo code LockedOnNFL on all lowercase for a first deposit match up to $100. If the New Orleans Saints are seriously going to weather the PR storm that would come with hiring Jon Gruden, who has an active lawsuit open against the NFL, big sort of strides made towards that on Wednesday, by the way. And that's all stemming from the emails that were uncovered, racist, homophobic, misogynistic slurs, things like that used in a series of emails between 2011 to 2018. People have the opportunity to grow. I get it. So if the New Orleans Saints are going to bring him in and bring all that baggage along with him, they've got to be doing it for a good reason. And that good reason for them, for the New Orleans Saints, not necessarily for me, but for the New Orleans Saints, would hopefully be wins in the win column, improving on the offensive side of the football, things like that. So what exactly would Jon Gruden bring to the New Orleans Saints in a, let's call it like a senior offensive assistant role or something like that? Now, I want to be clear. The reason why I mentioned the senior offensive assistant role is because it's become very clear that the Saints aren't interested in him coming in and replacing anybody, at least at this time, right? They wouldn't be bringing him in to become the new offensive coordinator right off the bat. They would be bringing him in as somebody that could come in and, be, sort of an offensive assistant, help with some of the play drawing, scheme, offensive install, stuff like that. And if the New Orleans Saints still wanted to make a change at offensive coordinator, which I think that they still must do, and they still must make a change at offensive play caller in particular, that Ronald Curry could be a guy to make sense. That makes sense. Ronald Curry stepping into that role with Jon Gruden, kind of mentoring him throughout the way. Him and Jon Gruden already have an existing relationship. Jon Gruden was the first guy to give Ronald Curry, or to hire Ronald Curry. He was the first entry point for Ronald Curry into NFL coaching. So the relationship could work. So what is it that Jon Gruden would bring? Well, there's a couple of different things. And I'm going to say this right off the bat. I worry that bringing in a Jon Gruden doesn't necessarily help you get into today's class of NFL offenses and things like that. That instead you're kind of going, I don't mean to say it this way, but you're kind of going counterculture, right? Like you're going a little bit against the grain if you bring in a Jon Gruden to help you revamp your offensive system. He does a lot of great things in terms of motion, eye candy, utilizing the running backs and fullbacks in the passing game, all that. But he's not necessarily as systematic as a Kyle Shanahan or as a Sean McVay, who will run a lot of the same plays with different window dressing, right? Look a little bit different. They're going to run, this same play out of this same formation, but they're going to start in this formation, motion back into that formation and run that play again. Or they're going to run that play out of a different formation or the same formation, but with different personnel and things like that. Like that's a lot of what you see with the 49ers and with the Los Angeles Rams offense. For Jon Gruden, the way that he has tended in the past, at least, to approach offense is similar to the way that Sean Payton approached offense. So here we go again, recycling an older playbook. And what I mean by kind of doing the same things as Sean Payton, it's a thick playbook, a lot of C's in that playbook, right? Like there's a lot that goes on there, bunch of different personnel groupings, bunch of different formations, bunch of different plays, all this other stuff. It kind of goes the volume approach, which worked. I mean, if you look back in 2020, that was an NFL offense in Las Vegas / Oakland that year that was really good. Scored over 30 points per game for a while. They were up there in terms of scoring in the NFL. They were 7th in the NFL for the most part of that season in motion usage in terms of percentage and things like that at just over 16%. Like you saw some of those things. So some of the stuff that's missing from the New Orleans Saints offense has been something that you would get with a Jon Gruden offense, right? Like motion, eye candy, all those other things. I'll give you an example. Jon Gruden likes to come in and maybe go with like one of those kind of bunch formations, very heavy look formation, and then motion this player from the right side to the left side, a post snap motion that brings, a tight end across the back of the formation. That's the second piece of eye candy. And then also run play action as a part of that, turn the back to the defense and then be able to take a shot over the top. It also utilizes things like RPOs. We saw that with him and Derek Carr, situations to where, they were trying to isolate, a certain safety and things like that. And if that safety didn't break on a tight end that was running out of the kind of inline formation, they would end up snapping the ball. Derek Carr would get a look at that. And then instead of handing the ball off, he would throw to that tight end. But if that safety broke on that tight end, then you hand the ball off. And then that's one less player that's crashing down, trying to get a stop in the middle of the field and things like that. So you get RPOs, you get a lot of motion, you get a lot of eye candy, you get more play action, things like that. My only concern is, can he take what he has done in the past, install it with new eyes, like a Ronald Curry, for instance, or some other offensive coordinator that they bring in, whomever, if they don't go with Pete Carmichael again, which I think if they went with Pete Carmichael again, like that is such a tough sell to your fan base at that point. Like you would just enrage a lot of people if you ran that back again, right? Even with Jon Gruden looming over the shoulders, it's not something that I think is the way that you want to kind of like welcome everybody into the 2024 season. You can move Pete Carmichael to another position, things like that, if you don't want to, move on from him entirely and all that. Like we just watched the Seattle Seahawks move Pete Carroll to a different position on an advisory role. Clearly not Pete Carroll's decision, clearly the organization's decision. But like if they can do that, then like you can move your offensive coordinator that has struggled to be a play caller over the course of the past 2 years to a different position and work on advancing that. But my big question is, can you bring in a Jon Gruden to effectively spearhead your offense, right? To effectively be the guy that helps to install, create all these other things. Although he wouldn't carry the title of offensive coordinator, he would have a very offensive coordinator-like presence, I would imagine, in that setup. And so can you do that and also bring your offense into the modern age of the NFL? And I know that like the Saints hate it when you say, or not the Saints hate it, but like any NFL team, right, would hate it if you talked about like bringing their offense into the modern offense, stuff like that. What does that really mean and everything? What we're really talking about is like introducing more trendy schemes and more trendy sort of impact or elements to your offense. That's really what we're talking about. We're talking about modernizing the offense. Any offense that's operating today is a modern offense, but can you take things that are sweeping across the NFL and utilize them for your offense so that you're staying up to date with the way that offense is moving as it continues to move forward? So it's not really just about being a modern offense. It's, can you be a prolific offense? Can you be a trend-setting offense? And so there is something to sort of the counter approach of that, of trying to create those trends and be first on this, that, and the other and all that. But more importantly, can you win games? And that's exactly what the New Orleans Saints would have to do if they went this route. Am I confident that they could do it? Not so much. But in any case, it feels like you would still be able to move your offense forward. So we'd have to see exactly how all of it would work out. And speaking of moving forward, is Jimmy Graham moving on? Some of his social media posts tend to insinuate that he might be retiring here soon. I'll tell you what I know, and I'll tell you what I think the New Orleans Saints would do if Jimmy Graham did retire. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp Therapy Online has been awesome for me, and I think it can be awesome for you too. Some people kind of, turn their nose up at therapy. I know I used to be that person. I came up in a family that did that. I came up around people that did that and things like that. So I kind of learned that behavior. But once I realized that sometimes like therapy is not necessarily about going in and always just talking about what's wrong. Sometimes it's about celebrating the progress that you've already made. Maybe you've, especially like in New Year's when you're trying to look at all these drastic changes and how do I get better? How do I do this different? All that other stuff. Maybe it's time to just kind of pat yourself on the back for a second. And a licensed therapist can absolutely help you do that, as well as maybe addressing some of those other things that you want to change in your life, but without you having to go down the road of making massive changes. So how about this? Celebrate the progress that you've already made with our friends at BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/locked-on for 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/locked-on. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Appreciate you very much for being here. Is Jimmy Graham fixing to retire? He finna retire? I don't know what's going on. We're going to have to take a look at it. We're going to be breaking it all down. Appreciate you very much for being in every day or making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out that Locked On Sports Today 24/7 YouTube stream, the first of its kind when it comes to national sports. You can go and check that out over on the Locked On Sports Today YouTube page. Go and subscribe. Be a part of history. So, is Jimmy Graham finna retire? Like, it sure feels that way. He's posting things saying, it's been real, New Orleans, posting pictures of him flying over the Crescent City through his airplane. Remember, he is a pilot and all that, in addition to also like riding his bike and stuff like that. So I think the question that I'm trying to figure out here is that like, it's very clear, at least from my approximation of what we're seeing from Jimmy Graham right now, the social media post with the photo of New Orleans from overhead, it's been real, Nola. The other social media posts of him, on X where he was talking about like, it's been great. Like, thank you so much for all the love and support and for welcoming me back, all these other things. It feels very much like the book and the final chapter of Jimmy Graham in New Orleans has been written. But is he retiring is another question. Because remember, this is a guy that's been talking all season about how this is the best he's ever felt and all these other things. And I know like some of that's just player speak, right? Like you get that all the time. Like, oh yeah, no, I've never felt better, yada, yada, all that other stuff. But like, this is a dude that caught 6 passes, 4 touchdowns in New Orleans. Like, man, like you certainly feel like if there was an opportunity to bring him back in 2024, you kind of entertain it. I mean, it's tough, right? Like you've got Juwan Johnson, you've got Foster Moreau. Right now, Taysom Hill's still on that team. They should get younger at that position and draft a tight end or maybe look for a younger tight end in free agency as well. Like there's a lot of different ways that the Saints can look at adding talent to that position. So it might make it really tough to get Jimmy Graham back on the field. And you'd rather your time with Jimmy Graham end now than him come back for training camp, be on the 90-man roster, try to work to get back on the roster, have to make a tough decision to maybe let him go, maybe add him to the practice squad. Does he really want to stick around and do that from the practice squad side of things? That could be really tough, right? So like, that's just the reality of it. Like if we remove the idea that like, oh, well, Jimmy Graham's so cool, and we remove sort of the emotional connection to what Jimmy Graham brought back to New Orleans and what Jimmy Graham has brought to New Orleans over the time, there's like a pragmatic approach, a realistic approach that you look at and you go, yeah, okay, maybe you don't want to go that route. And so maybe the New Orleans Saints, who are looking at all these like culture shift ideas and trying to get younger on the roster and things like that, they got 14 players over the age of 30. The Green Bay Packers have 2 players over the age of 30. Shout out Doug Mouton for a great a great tidbit there. But I don't know. It just kind of feels like maybe that chapter was the final chapter. And Jimmy Graham might be done here in New Orleans. And I will say that like, that's sad, right? Because it was so cool to see him come back, and score touchdowns and like have those great moments and stuff like that, leading the Who Dat chant and everything in the dome and stuff. Like, just how freaking cool. You know what I mean? And I'll say for me, like as somebody that grew up in this community, that's watched this community, that knows very well, better than many others, the connection between this community and the New Orleans Saints organization, although things are a little rocky right now, but like looking at it over the course of the entire span of the existence of the franchise, the city's involvement, all that other stuff, and back and forth, the franchise's involvement in the city, it was so cool. to just have like a front row seat effectively to Jimmy Graham's big return to the city of New Orleans. I got to watch in person every single one of his touchdowns from the press box. And look, I'm not going to cheer. I'm not going to do anything like that. I can't be a fan, quote unquote, in that way, but I can understand and appreciate the impact. And if anybody tells me not to, get out of my face. Like, very easy, very simple. Like, the people of New Orleans are incredibly important to me. These are my people, not my people, right? But these are the people that I'm a part of, right? This is the group. This is the collective that I consider myself a part of and that I'm fortunate enough to be a part of. And so I get it when somebody comes in and has an impact the way that Jimmy Graham had an impact. Like, there was never a day in 2011 that I didn't talk about Jimmy Graham. There was never a day, you know what I mean? Like, those kinds of things. And so to be able to like really watch him and see him live in person on a week by week basis when they allowed him, when they had him active, it was cool. It was awesome. It was more than cool. It was really awesome. And I'm really grateful I got to kind of experience that with you and appreciate that with you, because that's really, really cool, right? So if this is the last chapter of Jimmy Graham's book with the New Orleans Saints, I think it was a pretty positive one. I wish they would have gotten him back out on the field a lot more. I wish that he would have been able to get another touchdown against Atlanta at the end of the season. I'm so happy Jamal Williams got his touchdown at the end of the year, but I wouldn't have been mad if it was Jimmy. You know what I mean? So like, I'm all about all that. I think that that's all awesome. And so if this is the end for Jimmy Graham, it will be interesting to see, is it the end in New Orleans or does he retire? And if he's retiring, then gosh, I hope that he does that, that 1 day deal or whatever. Technically, he's still under contract and all this other stuff, but until the new league year and everything. So he could retire a Saint and up until basically like the middle of March or second week of March. But man, if that's not the case and his contract just expires and he goes off the grid for a little while, kind of resets, thinks about stuff, and then, maybe he's thinking about, will he come back? Then I would love that he came back to New Orleans, first of all. But if he didn't, I would love if he made the decision to retire, to sign that like 1 day deal that people thought that his original contract was going to be. Remember that when he signed with New Orleans, everybody was like, oh yeah, it's a 1 day deal. He's going to retire. And we're all like, no fam, like that's a 1 year deal. That's a legit deal. He's trying to get back on the field. And then we watched him do it. It was so cool. And then so I hope that he does the 1 day deal, retires as a New Orleans Saint. He absolutely deserves that. He's a Saints Hall of Famer. He's a Hall of Famer. I think like a year like this kind of solidified it for me that he can come in, play that role, and then still make those big catches, catch those big touchdowns in the end zone. Like, he didn't need to be wide open. Like, he out-muscled some dudes. Remember, he put that gluteus Jimmius down on somebody, right? That Jimmius Maximus. Like, you saw all that, and so I just loved it. And would I love to see more of it in 2024? Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd love to see more of it in 2024. But man, like, if this is the end for Jimmy, I sure hope that he gets the opportunity to do what he deserves, which is retire as a New Orleans Saint, and that he's very, very quickly added to that Ring of Honor, very, very quickly added to that Saints Hall of Fame. I don't know. There might be a certain number of years you have to do and stuff like that before you're able to be on there. But I mean, they should be the Ring of Honor. Like, they should be making the names, the letters. They should be making all of it right now, because he 100% deserves to be up there. So we'll see what happens with Jimmy Graham. But boy, it sure does. Like, if you look back at all those things, and I've asked some people on things like that, I haven't gotten any responses yet. But like, man, if it certainly looks like it's the end for Jimmy Graham, and I hope that for him it was as fulfilling a final year as it was for the New Orleans Saints fan base, who would have loved to have seen him more, but still found it so fulfilling to see him back in New Orleans and be able to potentially conclude his career where he belongs, which is here in the Big Easy. All right, y'all, coming up next, we're going to take a look at my top 6 free agents for the New Orleans Saints this offseason. Who stays, who goes, who do I think should stay, versus what do I think will happen. So I'm going to give you opinion and what I think will actually happen, including why I think Jameis Winston should be a New Orleans Saint in 2024. Yeah, we're going to get to that as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends at Jase Medical. Jase Medical is doing everything to make sure that you have what you need, that you're prepared, that you're good in case you have like a pop-up illness in the home, infections, things like that. Everything from UTIs to respiratory infections, sinusitis, skin infections, amongst a whole bunch of other stuff. Jase Medical has you covered. You know how hard it can be sometimes to get the medication that you need and stuff like that. Jase Medical comes through with their Jase case, 5 different antibiotics that treat 50 or more different bacterial infections. Doesn't that sound awesome, right? Like real peace of mind, especially if you're dealing with weather, power outages, things like that. Like you want to be prepared. So Jase Case is going to help you get that done. Visit JaseMedical.com today to complete your physician encounter. It'll be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of their regular costs. It's never been more easy to be prepared than right now, thanks to Jase Medical. Go to JaseMedical.com, use the promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off of your order. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with my top 6 free agents for the New Orleans Saints and whether I think that they should stay, should go, and whether I think that they will stay, will go. So I want to start off with Jameis Winston. And listen, I don't know if you've caught the Amy Trask conversation around Dennis Allen, where she was talking about like, hey, look, when I saw what happened with Jameis Winston and kind of like going off script there and snapping the ball, handing it off to Jamal Williams to get him his touchdown, I wasn't surprised, basically is what she was saying. The other thing, though, that she said that I thought was so genius was this idea that, look, if you're Dennis Allen and you can get Jameis Winston to stay for another year, that means a lot. Like you saw all of the outpouring of support that went for Jameis Winston, even though it wasn't just Jameis Winston's decision. But I love what Amy said about like, if the Saints just cast off Jameis Winston, what's the message that sends to the rest of the players, knowing that like this is just a situation, and Mickey Loomis said it himself. So if you're acknowledging on one hand that, look, the Saints didn't do anything wrong, they were just doing something really, really good for a teammate, then you have to acknowledge on the other hand, then great, then you can't really hold that decision against them as being disobedient or whatever it is that you want to look at. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the New Orleans Saints handle this because it's kind of landmine-ish, right? So if the Saints find a way to keep Jameis Winston in New Orleans, that maybe sends a really good message to the rest of the roster of like, look, it doesn't matter that he made that decision. He was doing that for a good reason, and the Saints would love to keep him. Now, up until now, I've been completely convinced that no matter what, Jameis Winston was gone at the end of this year. He's a guy that has starting quarterback talent. He deserves to go out there and look for another opportunity. But with all the new coaches, all the rookie quarterbacks, Justin Fields potentially being moved, what's going to happen with Zach Wilson once Aaron Rodgers is healthy, all this other stuff, like there's enough competition out there that it might be a little bit challenging for Jameis Winston to find that starting role. So if Dennis Allen could find a way, and the New Orleans Saints can find a way to keep Jameis Winston in New Orleans, you know what? I think they should do it. Do I think that it will happen? No. But do I think that it should? Yes. All right, let's take a look at a couple of other free agents here. This one's actually really easy. I want to get this one out of the way. Rashid Shaheed, exclusive rights free agent, meaning he can't go and talk to other teams, and the Saints are just going to give him like a minimum deal and he's back. Like that's going to be what it's going to be. Like it's super simple to be an exclusive right. When you're an exclusive rights free agent, you're not really going anywhere, stuff like that. So the Saints will be able to bring Rashid Shaheed back. No problem. He will be here in 2024. No doubt about it. The big thing will be, do they give him an extension? Do they bring him back for more than 1 year? I think that they should. I think they should try to lock him down for 2-3 years if they can before his value continues to skyrocket. And the Saints have done a good job with this kind of stuff in the past, so we'll see what happens with Rashid Shaheed. But I think not only should Rashid Shaheed be back in 2024. I played that up a little bit. It was fun. But they should try to get him for 2025 too, if they can. And let's look at Michael Thomas, right? This is a big one. Wide receiver Michael Thomas. His contract is, they have to move some things around and then he'll be over. So he'll be a free agent nonetheless. And look, I don't think he'll be back in New Orleans. I wouldn't bring him back at this point. I think that this is a part of like you getting younger and being able to do it. Like Mike's had so many injury things and stuff like that, not being able to effectively be on the field over the course of the last 4 seasons. And he's fought, right? I don't want to discount how much he has fought to be out on the field. You know what I mean? But it hasn't worked. And I think the New Orleans Saints at this point need to cut bait. It'll be really cool to see if he ends up maybe in Denver with Sean, but we'll see how that relationship actually look like over the course of this offseason. But yeah, I don't expect to see Michael Thomas back in New Orleans, and I don't think it's the worst decision for the New Orleans Saints to make that choice either. Let's take a look at next. I'm going to start going by alphabetical order here now. Zach Bond, he should be back in 2024. I don't think he's going to be, though, and I don't blame him. I think that there's a system for him somewhere else, Philadelphia, Miami, San Francisco. There's systems for him out there that I think he would be such a good fit for. And for Zach Bond, I think he should take those opportunities if they're out there. But if nothing else, he taught the New Orleans Saints that, hey, having this little bit of a changeup of a speedier edge rusher, more athletic edge rusher, it works, bro. It works. Even with your overall prototype, you don't have to change the prototype. You can continue to invest in the prototype, but to have that mold ready to go, I think that there's ways for the Saints to be able to reinvest in that. So while I don't think that Zach Bond will be a New Orleans Saint in 2024, although he should be, I don't think that his presence and the impact that he's had will leave with him. I think that we'll see somebody else slide in and kind of fill that Caden Ellis, Zach Bond role the Saints have continuously developed over at that linebacker spot. Andrus Peat, I think the Saints should pull the trigger here and allow him to go out there and find his thing. I don't think he's back in 2024. I don't think he needs to be back in 2024. I wouldn't bring him back in 2024. I know he played really well at left tackle. I know all that. He went 16 games this season, but can you trust him to do it again when his track record otherwise throughout his years tells you that he can't? And especially at a position like left tackle where you already have so much turmoil, let him go, let him move on. I think that that's what's going to happen. And right now he's probably going to get a left tackle. If you sign in New Orleans, you have to give him a left tackle contract, right? You can't not. If he signs somewhere else, maybe he gets a left tackle contract. So he should go out there and try to find that left tackle contract. But it would be tough for New Orleans to kind of bring him back and then give him an interior offensive line contract and then try to put him back at that spot. Once you've played left tackle and shown that you can do it, your value's through the roof. Defensive tackle Malcolm Roach was one of the best run stoppers in the NFL, not just for the New Orleans Saints, but in the NFL up until his injury. I think he should be back in 2024 as well, and I think he will be back in 2024. I think he's one of those guys. I think he's one of those people that believes in what the New Orleans Saints have to offer, that likes the locker room, that likes and fits in well within the defensive line room. He's a guy that went and tested the market last year, and then ended up coming back to New Orleans. Now he's had this season-ending injury. It might make it a little bit tougher for him to find opportunities elsewhere, although he would deserve any opportunity that he got. He's a very good player. But I hope and believe that he'll be back in 2024. And then finally, have I said anybody that I don't think? Oh, yeah, Zach Bond and Andrus Peat. Okay, so I'm not being overly optimistic here. I did mention those. I'm also naming 7 players. I said 6. Okay, well, you get 7. A little bit of lanyap, right? That's what we talk about all the time. Lastly, Isaac Yiadom. I think he should be back. I think he will be back. I think he's a Joe Woods guy. I think he's a Dennis Allen guy. I think that he's one of those dudes that came in, he was given an opportunity, and then he just took off. If the New Orleans Saints decide to move on from Marshawn Lattimore, that makes this even more important. I think Isaac Yiadom's back in 2024, and I think that's a great call for New Orleans. I think it's a great call for Isaac as well, for Ike as well. He clearly found something that works for him here in New Orleans, and the New Orleans Saints clearly found him as something that works for them here in New Orleans as well. All right. Thanks as always, making us your first listen of the day every day for your second listen. You got to go check out Locked on LSU. Caroline Fenton probably going crazy right now with the big Nick Saban retirement. You do not want to miss that. What does that mean for the LSU Tigers moving forward? And is Brian Kelly now the best coach in the SEC? She's got it all covered for you over at Locked On LSU. Appreciate you as always, making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.